Hey, welcome once again to Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. I'm Bob Frantz. Chris Martz. This guy is incredible. He's a meteorology student in Virginia. That's right. Now, he's a student of meteorology, but to me, he has reached full professorial status online. He has over 80,000 followers on Twitter and nearly 20,000 on Facebook, nearly all of them people like me, addicted to the truth about climate change. And he brings it. He brings the data, he brings the science, he brings the research, he brings the receipts. He debunks virtually every climate change alarmist working in the pseudoscience of climate change alarmism today. You can follow his work on X at Chris Martz WX, which is weather, of course, on Facebook at Chris Martz Weather, and of course by way of his blog site, which is chrismartzweather.com. But today we get him in person right here on Strictly Speaking. Chris Martz, good to have you, man. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here, man. I have been a fan of yours for, I don't know, a few months, I guess. You know what it was? When I first tripped over you, I was on my Strictly Speaking site. I've got two sites on Twitter, and I'm just bumping around, and I saw some weather map, and people are freaking out. They're calling my radio show and everybody in my private, about, oh my God, because we had that run of 90 plus degree days in July. And
Yeah.
maybe that's why the algorithm steered you, into other people's timelines or pages that wouldn't have seen it otherwise. But I read one of your posts, and I'm thinking this guy isn't just doing what I would do, which is be a big mouth and just argue. Oh my God, because I've had a few climate people on the show and on the radio show in the past, and they talk about it. Really depends on when they talk about record temperatures. When did they start keeping the records? Why are
Yeah.
you not looking beyond that, and so forth? And that's what I would have done in a very general sense. And then I read your specifics, and I said, this guy is all over it. He's got to be like one of the foremost climatology and meteorology, voices in the country. I wanted to learn more about you. I didn't know you were still a student, man. So
Yeah.
tell everybody about yourself. Tell everybody who Chris Martz Weather really is.
Yeah. So what you see is kind of what you get with me as far as my personality and stuff goes. But I'm a senior meteorology major at Millersville University near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Actually, I live in Virginia, but I go to school up in Pennsylvania.
Oh,
So
I had that reversed. I thought you lived in PA and went to school. I mean,
yep,
went to school.
I live in Virginia, and I go to school up here in Pennsylvania. And we just yesterday was the first day of classes for senior year. So
Mhm.
in 36 weeks' time, I'll be a actual degree, credentialed meteorologist. But as far as my knowledge, a lot of things go. I've been researching this stuff for many years. Um, Back, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, I was kind of for just on my high school, middle school teachers, that good teachers, but my science teachers were on the mainstream side of the climate change, the
Mhm.
science and stuff on that of like how this is the basics, that this is a problem and the weather is getting worse. It's more extreme now than it was when your grandparents were alive. We're seeing more heat waves, we're seeing more floods, more droughts, more hurricanes, stuff like that, and that it's our fault because of our burning of fossil fuels for reliable energy and affordable energy, and that was the cause of this rise of temperature, which influences all these other things. And I was just kind of that was kind of the mainstream kind of point of view. And the idea was is that this is a problem and we can fix this, especially with sea level rise, stuff like that. And I just was kind of casually bought into all of it, and that I just went along with it. I thought, okay, these are my teachers. What they're saying is probably correct. And I get in conversations with my dad about it, and he'd be like, "Well, there's these ice ages and these the Milankovitch cycles and 100,000 years, and we're in an interglacial period right now. So we're not in the glacial maximum. We're in an ice age technically because there's ice at the poles, but there's glacial maximum where the glaciers advance, ice sheets advance, sea ice extents greater, and there's glacial minima, which is the interglacial between glacial cycles, which we're in right now." And my dad's like, these things happen in cycles. So it's a lot of this is probably just natural. Now, obviously, I can tell you right now that a lot of that doesn't really have anything to do with like multi-decadal changes and stuff that's concerned with respect to modern global warming. But he had a point, and I was going to argue with him back and forth about it for many years. And when I was going up through K through 12 education, K 12 education, and eventually one day I stumbled across a guy, meteorologist, to the name Joe Bastardi, and he lives up in near State College, Pennsylvania. He's a meteorologist for AccuWeather for over 30 years, and now he's at a private consulting firm called Weatherbell, which they do like private forecasts for energy companies and stuff. And he's a frequent guest on like news programs. Like he used to be on CNN, and when they allowed different points of view, he's still frequently on like Sean Hannity's program and stuff. So you'll see him there. But I became friends with him, and I followed his Twitter page, and he started, and I came across a guy by the name of Tony Heller. There's a YouTube channel, and they always, well, Heller would post videos about weather events from the past, like hurricanes of the 1930s and 1960s, 50s, whatever decade it was, and how the heat waves during the Dust Bowl period of the 1930s were far worse than anything we've seen in the last 40 years. And it's about floods, like the floods from the 1800s and 1927 Mississippi River flood. And Joe Bastardi would tell you what hurricane happened on what date and what year, and Tony Heller could tell you what the temperature was on what date and what town on what given day and what year. And I began to see a side of things that I didn't see from mainstream news sources. My teachers weren't telling me. They were saying that these weather events the weather's always been extreme. We have always had hurricanes. We've always had droughts. We've had, in many cases, it's been far worse in the past than it is now. And that began to get the wheels turning in my head. I'm like, why is the media, not telling us the full story? Why are my science teachers not talking about this? So it became a passion for me to actually want to dig into the data and learn more and question I was kind of, I was sort of a climate alarmist. I wasn't people throwing the paint at the Stonehenge or cans of soup at the Mona Lisa. And I'm not gluing my hand to the road, but I was kind of concerned. So I was on the other side at one point. And then I became interested in this, decided to pursue a meteorology degree, started doing my own research, started reading the actual studies that are published in the literature, not just what the media spins. I read the IPCC reports, part of them.
Chris, when are we talking about here? Is this like shortly after you graduated high school that you kind of
Yes,
started it?
this is like high school, late high school, early college.
Okay, go ahead.
And so I began to start questioning a lot of things with what I was told by my science teachers through middle and high school. And I began to question what was being reported in terms of how whether a weather event was unprecedented or not, and whether or not these things were actually becoming more frequent, like hurricanes becoming more frequent and intense, tornadoes, floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires. And it turns out that in most cases, it's been more extreme in the past. In a lot of data sets, if you look at it, there's been either no trend in these events or they've gone down. It's actually the weather's gotten a little bit better, in spite of the fact that the planet has warmed. So I realized that my position on this was wrong. So I took a second glance at it. I took an objective analysis of it, and my views changed. And people always on the alarmist side say that I'm under the thumb of big oil, and that they pay me to spout climate change denial, or that I'm some right wing, you know. But they don't realize that I used to be a climate alarmist. I
Mhm.
used to be on their side. Perhaps it's not my judgment that's clouded. So I decided to pursue meteorology, and I'm getting my degree, and it's something I'm passionate about is the data analysis, understanding. Okay, as a scientist, you have to measure things. You have to look at data, and you have to test hypotheses, theories against that data, and that data has to be measured observations, whether it's indirect measurements or you take measurements of something else, and then you compute some sort of variable from that. But all science is numbers. Science isn't, and it's not just model data. Models are not evidence of anything. They're helpful tools to analyze things, break down complex equations. But models are just a tool. They're not evidence of anything. So when it comes to evidencing, that means that you have to look at data, what's been collected, what's been measured. And as a scientist, as a scientist in training, I like to take a look at claims. So CNN will run a headline saying this is the hottest it's ever been on Earth in 125,000 years, or something like that. I could take that claim and I can look at the proxy data and I can say that, well, that's probably not true. And we also don't have fine enough resolution with these proxy data to be able to indicate what the temperature was for a single year, let alone a day.
Right.
They say it's the hottest day ever, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But or they'll make a claim. The Washington Post will say this was the worst hurricane to hit Florida on record, and you can look at the data and say, nope, that wasn't the case. That was Labor Day in 1935. So you take a claim and you test that against what the actual data shows. That's what you do in science. But a lot of science now revolves around starting with a predetermined conclusion and working backwards to try and find data to find what you're being funded to find.
Right.
So that's kind of my story. So that's kind of the gist of it. But yeah, I used to be a climate alarmist, and not a climate activist, but I was an alarmist. I was concerned, and now I'm more of a I guess you would consider a skeptic, lukewarmer, somebody like that.
Well, you're a truth teller, is what you're doing, which is what all of these slides and all of these charts and everything you've put together are going to show. That you're showing everybody that you have built this massive following, over 82,000 followers now, by the way. So, a couple of follow ups there before we get into some of that. What do you want to do? Because I see you're a meteorology student. I think this guy want to be the weather guy in the 6 and 11 news and just tell everybody what's going to happen tomorrow. You seem to be wanting to go much further than that. What is your goal?
I'm more a research kind of guy. I used to want to do day to day forecasting, and I used to want to go on TV, but I find that news is, at least in the mainstream sense, is too partisan these days, one way or the other.
Mhm.
And I don't really want to be beholden. I want to be able to speak freely and say what I want from a scientific researcher's perspective. I don't want to have to deal with pressure in academia, going the university route to teach at a school necessarily. If this was the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, that was probably the route I would go. But it's
Well,
a different
the good
culture.
news is it's a good thing you don't want to do that because they wouldn't let you do that. I
They
mean,
wouldn't let me. Oh,
right? I mean, especially, you everything you're doing right now, you have already at your young age stuck a finger in the eye of all of these, climatologists and everyone with an agenda. The alarmists that you're talking about, the ones who are getting paid and funded to find evidence to support that mankind is causing all of this so that they can literally tax everybody to within an inch of their lives through carbon taxes and so forth. You have already come out and said, I'm challenging all your data. You're putting it out there. You're getting a massive following. So are you worried about what your future holds career wise, given the fact that cancel culture goes after people like you for daring to challenge narratives like this?
I receive threats all the time from people. People have been trying to get me kicked out of my undergraduate program for the last 3 of my 4 years here. So this is my fourth year, but the last, I guess,
Fellow
especially
students?
no, not students. No, I find that a lot of students, um, a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of them agree with me on a lot of things. Um, and the ones that don't, they don't hate me. I have a great relationship with pretty much everybody, and my professors included. My professors actually, for the most part, defend my right to freedom of speech. They're kind of old school. They might not agree with everything I say. They certainly don't. My position is mine alone. I don't. What I say on my pages reflects my views and my views only. They're not the universities. They're not my peers. They're not my professors. It's mine. It's Chris's and Chris's alone. But everybody, they defend my right to freedom of speech, and they understand that I back my points up with data, and we're open to friendly debate. There's been a lot of attacks from outside coming in, and I probably wouldn't be able to get a job because of how many people follow me, and how much of the, I'm in the news, all the time with things and headlines and stuff. So I wouldn't be able to probably get a job in academia. I don't want to spend a career in academia. I don't want to be at a university where you're on a chain. They pull your chain and they tell you what you can and cannot say, and what you can and cannot do, or how you can or cannot go about doing research. Same thing with government. Same thing with, and in TV meteorology, it's a lot. There are some meteorologists that speak freely about it. It depends on the station, depends on the market, depends on who's your station manager, and what company maybe owns that station. If it's like Sinclair, or if it's a different broadcast organization. This would have been the route I would have gone. Any of those routes 20, 30 years ago, when it was not so hyper political like it is now.
Right.
But I also realized a long time ago that I want to do something that stands out. I don't want to be a cookie cutter meteorologist. Everybody's going into forecasting. They're all, oh, I'm going to the National Weather Service, or I'm going to this private forecasting company, or I'm going into TV. I'm going into research, academia or government research, like these big organizations. I want to do things my way only. And I want to make a difference in terms of presenting its data and showing people that things aren't as bad as they are. So this summer, I've been interning with this organization called the Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. The acronym is CFACT. And
I
so
like
I
it.
work with Craig Rucker. He's our president, and he's constantly we're in the press all the time at all the things like CO2 Coalition or Heartland Institute, which you might have heard of. We're in the news more than anybody, and we kind of stick it to the greens and stuff, and we have a lot of fun. Mark Morano is our director of communications. He worked with Senator James Inhofe in the Senate and Environment and Public Works Committee for many years, and he's our director of communications. He's a frequent guest on Fox News. He's on Fox and Friends. He's on Hannity, Jesse Waters. He was on Tucker Carlson when he was on there, and he actually was on CNN. He debated Bill Nye, the science guy, on CNN many years ago. And CNN used to allow those different viewpoints, and back then they don't have them on much anymore. But that's what we do. We're an environmental organization. We fight for free market solutions to our energy problem. We want the free market, the consumers, to decide which technology is superior and what should be utilized, whether that's nuclear or natural gas as the better alternatives. But nuclear is fantastic, as opposed to, say, coal. But we're very much against wind and solar, like utility scale solar and wind. Um, we go after energy companies that put up these projects, such as the Nantucket wind turbine that was big in the news, the offshore wind they're trying to put up off the coast of Virginia and New Jersey. We are very much opposed to that, and so we go after these energy companies. Our company, or we file CFAX files lawsuits against them. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't, but we influence policy in a way to protect the environment, but allow the consumer, not the government, to determine what energy technologies we should use. And they like my climate data, my analysis, because we put together these big reports. And they're working on fact sheets that are soon going to be up on cfact.org. It's going to be sent out to our donors and for the public to use, to hopefully give you kind of a broad overview of what the science actually shows, that the data actually shows on climate trends, to have better energy policy. Because if you don't have good science, you can't have good energy policy. And that affects millions, even billions of people.
Of course. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's supposed to be about trusting the science. We were told that about COVID. We were told that about climate. We're told that about everything. So, and we'll get to cfact.org in a minute. I want to bring up your first. Now, I just went to your Facebook page, is what I've done here, and I want to pull up several of your posts. And I did it just in reverse chronological order because I was being lazy. When I wrote my little intro for you that I wrote there, and I said, he brings the receipts, he brings the data, he brings the science, I want to talk about where that comes from, because what you have become is you are our research. In other words, when somebody says do the homework and find out the facts about whatever, we're looking up Chris Martz's stuff now. Where did Chris Martz look up stuff? When you see, let's just pull the first one up. Go ahead and pull any one of those up, Dylan. I don't care about the dates anymore. It's fine. August 13th. Okay, there you go. Hey there, climate alarmists tell us that heat waves are becoming more and more common in the United States, but that's not true. And you get into a full-on explanation there. And then here's your chart. And here's your graph from 1900 through 2020. That's a new word for me. Conterminous U.S. observed number of heat wave days, 1895 to 2023. Chris, where, when you go get your receipts, are you getting them from?
So this chart here, is the conterminous United States. It's basically that it's lower 48. That's what that means. It means like that's the together. That's what that word means.
Okay.
Like you might see contiguous, but yes, uh,
US, right.
yeah. So what this chart is showing you is the average number of heat wave days per year. Now, this chart begins in 1895 and it ends in 2023. So it's all the way up through last year. This year is not on there because obviously we're not finished with the year. We're not even finished with summer yet. So we still have plenty of more days to add to whatever the tally is this year. So what I did, where I got this data is I looked at the thermometer. Me and Richard Lyon, as a guy that is good at programming and analyzing the entire temperature database, and he and I worked on this project. And I have all the links, and it's actually linked in the bottom below the chart, what this chart is about, and where you can access the data. This
Those are
data
the
is
receipts
from
I'm talking about. Yeah, those are the
yeah,
receipts. That's what I love
yeah.
about it. You're not just out there writing narratives and saying, trust me. You are saying comes from here, 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 and here. It's indisputable, which is, we'll get back to that, but continue.
But I always tell people, if you're going to make an argument, especially on our side, that's always constantly challenged and critiqued and slandered, labeled as deniers, whatever. It's important that you cite your sources accurately and you cite good data that's reputable. Now, this chart, as I said, it shows the average number of heat wave days per year, and this is for about 828 United States Historical Climatology Network daily stations, USHCND. Um, there's these weather stations, typically COOP stations. It's these like uh, any town would have this weather observations station, and it's like this white box, and it's painted white because the thermometer there's a min max thermometer, and it's like it's mercury, typically mercury and glass back then. Now it's all digital, but um, inside these Stevens, it's called a Stevenson screen. It's these white boxes, and they have louvered sides like shutters on a house, so it allows airflow through it. But it has a roof, so it prevents sunlight from hitting the thermometer directly because that would give it artificially high reading.
Makes sense.
So it's sheltered. It's an enclosed, sheltered white box painted white to reflect sunlight. It has a roof to prevent sunlight from obviously hitting the shelter, and it's got louvered sides, so it allows airflow through, so you don't get stagnant air. It gets the most accurate temperature reading. It's about
Sure.
2 meters off the ground, and it has a min max thermometer. And what this thermometer does is you have to reset it, and you hit. It's complex, and it's a little. It'll take some time to explain how these work, but basically, what happens is the mercury when you reset the thermometer in the morning, say the thermometer will, or you reset it at night, the thermometer will keep going up. The mercury keep going up, and it will. And each time the temperature changes, it goes up. It'll register a new high, and it'll lock in. So if you have like a high, say it's like 82 at 11 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning, it'll rise up, mark 82. Say at 10:30 it goes to 80 degrees. It's not the temperature goes down, but the mercury is still going to register 82 because it locked it in at what the high was.
Right.
And then it goes up. Say it goes up to 84. The mercury will go up to 84 and lock in. That way, you don't have to go and take measurements every 3 or 6 hours because sometimes the temperature doesn't always occur. Depends on cloud cover, depends on the season when the maximum temperature occurs. It's not always at 3 p.m. Sometimes it might be at noon. Sometimes it might be at 5 p.m. It just depends on season. Typically in the summer, it's typically a little bit later, around 4 p.m. The wintertime, it's right about 3 p.m. The morning low is usually about 6 or 7 a.m. It depends on when it's typically right after sunrise. So that changes. So if you take it at 3 p.m. every day, you might get a close, accurate, maximum for the day. Assuming there's no cold front, Arctic front that comes through and the temperatures drop through the day, or you get a warm front that comes through at night and it raises the temperature through the evening, versus the typical diurnal cycle. So it's going to be difficult. It might be somewhat accurate, but these thermometers were designed and they go back over a century. They lock in what the high
So
temperature
you
was.
you
So you
you
can
just
go about your daily
you
day and then you can come back in the evening and say, oh, it got to 95 degrees today. So that's how these thermometers work. They were placed at just random towns across the country. Eventually, a lot of them were moved to airports for aviation purposes because air traffic controllers and pilots needed this information to safely land and take airplanes off from airports. Um, anyway, so these thermometers were never intended to serve as a network for a global temperature monitoring, much less, even temperature monitoring of the United States. It was just supposed to be just weather observations
yeah.
because they're not spaced like evenly. They're not evenly distributed in a grid. So to make this chart more accurate, you'd probably have to do a little bit of weighted averaging, but overall it's pretty accurate because the US has decently good temperature station coverage. Now, this database is managed by NOAA. They have this data. It's directly from the NOAA repository. It's there. There's a link to it, and if anybody has computer skills, coding skills, Python skills, they can go and they can reproduce this exact chart with government data, and run it through a program and do it. But this chart shows an average number. If you pull up the chart again, it shows the average number of heat wave days per year since 1895. Now, the World Meteorological Organization defines a heat wave as
Can you throw that
at a
one back up
minimum.
again, Dylan? Can
At
you
a
throw that back up again for him?
They define it as a at minimum 3 consecutive day period where the daily maximum temperature, not the morning low, not the average temperature, but the daily maximum temperature is equal to or exceeds the 90th percentile for that date for that particular station versus the 1961 to 1990 average. And then you take a look at, you count the number. So that's what a heat wave is. It's 3 consecutive days where there's those conditions. It could be more days, but it has to be at least three. And then the number of heat wave days is where how many days of the calendar year are that fall under heat wave conditions. And then you take those for each station individually and you average them all together. That's how you get that chart. And it shows that the most heat waves were before 1960 in the United States. There's actually a slightly downward trend. And out of the top 10 years of the most number of heat waves, none of them have been in the last 35 years in the United States.
And that's where we come up with the irrefutable argument that you're making, that when they try to tell, I mean, they're trying to say that the burning of oil and coal and natural gas and the expansion of our carbon footprints and so on and so forth, the number of SUVs, the number of electric stoves and everything, I'm sorry, gas stoves, they're saying this is what's causing this in elevation in carbon and thus the elevation in temperatures. But are there more or less SUVs on the planet right now than there were, or in the United States right now than there were pre 1965? Are we burning more oil or less oil as the population explodes and grows and grows and so on and so forth? This is what I mean. And this is why they have to silence people like you, isn't it?
Yeah. It's funny. And their argument against that particular chart and the next one, which you have up right now that I'll get into here in just a second, their argument is that, well, the United States makes up less than 2% of global area, surface area. And that's true. It's about 1.8%. The entire US makes up about 1.8% of the global surface area. 70% of the surface is ocean. But the problem with that statement is that, one, we don't have a whole lot of long term, I'm talking about like over 100 years of daily temperature observations with good coverage, spatial coverage across the entire country, really anywhere outside the United States. We have some in Europe. There's been a little bit more warming in Europe than there has been in the United States. But you also have those stations in Eastern Australia, and that shows a very similar pattern. It was actually much hotter prior to 1900 in Australia, actually prior to 1910, but the Bureau of Meteorology there does not show pre 1910 data. It was actually very hot in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in Australia. But that's a whole other thing. I don't have a lot of data analysis on that myself, but Tony Heller has done that. But other than those places, there's really no stations that are there's not really many long-term stations outside of the United States and maybe southern Canada, which in Canada it shows this very similar patterns in the southern part of it, where we have that data. There's a few stations in Greenland. There's one in South America, Buenos Aires, which is a massive urban heat island, so that can be discounted. Iceland has decent coverage, but there's been really no warming in Iceland over the last century. It's just kind of up and down. The 1930s were actually the warmest. 20s and 30s are the warmest decade in Iceland. Greenland is not really any warmer now than it was in the 1930s either, at least in the southern part of it where we have good stations. So the United States has a very good data coverage.
Hold on a second. I want to emphasize what you're saying because I want people to hear those things. And this is what grabbed my attention with your stuff here is much higher in the 20s and 30s. You're saying, you're talking about these things and you're just kind of casually going over them. And I want those to sink into people who are thinking we are right now in the worst climate, the hottest climate in recorded history, not just American history, but world history, because this is what we're being told. This is what the, national, what is it? Atmospheric,
National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
That's the one. And all of these other climate alarmists that we're talking about are trying to convince us that the numbers you're giving us right now don't exist or that they can somehow be disputed. But you're going through very, very detailed chapter and verse here as to how that data was collected or that data is collected, and you're saying that the instruments, the same types of thermometers you just described for us that are being used now, were being used in 1895 when this thing started.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's digital now, obviously, but back then they were very accurate, if not more accurate, because a lot of the digital thermometers had to be recalibrated, and the mercury and glass ones don't tend to have those problems. They can get faulty with time, but the digital ones are always giving just woefully wrong readings for a number of reasons. A lot of them have these bimetallic strips that get worn, and it's the metallic strip, when it heats up, it expands and pushes a needle and it registers. It's complex how it works, but right. It's a whole course in instrumentation by how these work. But they get worn out over time. Mercury and glass thermometer readings are actually probably more accurate and precise than the digital ones we have today because of that. There's actually research on that. But back to my one argument. they'll say that again, it's less than 1%, it's less than 2% of global surface area of the United States. So these charts don't matter. As I said, the United States has most of the thermometer data in the world that's long term. So it makes sense to look at that data. It's not, it would be nice to have more comprehensive global picture, but we don't. Um, Except for again in Europe and in parts of Australia, in parts of the Arctic area, the southern parts of Greenland and Iceland, we have data. But that's really about it. We have nothing in Antarctica really prior to the 1940s. We have nothing in South America really prior to the 1950s, other than Buenos Aires and a few other stations. Africa still struggles with getting accurate temperature data to this day. And China didn't have temperature data until 1951. So again, that my grandma was born in 1944, so it's not that long ago. So the longer record you have, the more, if the shorter record you have, the more likely you're going to see record high temperatures or record low temperatures.
Sure.
The longer your record is, the less likely it is, and that's why you see more records in the 1920s, 1930s, 1910s, maybe 1980s in some places, because 1980s we had some really hot summers. But the other argument that I love about this is that these same people who make this argument that the US is less than 2% of global surface area, these are the same people, I should remind you, that act hysterical anytime there's a hot summer day in Chicago or DC or somewhere. So all of a sudden, then that argument doesn't matter, because that it's hot in Chicago on June 10th or whatever, so that's global warming. You point out that it was hotter in 1925. Now that's just weather. So the
Yeah.
people who
Or
they're hypocritical, but they know they are, and they don't care when you point that out. They just try, and it kind of infuriates me, because they understand they are, they don't care. They just like to shift the goalposts and try and gaslight you, and it
Well,
really.
yeah, they change the story every single time because they can't defeat the narrative or the information you have that blows up their narrative. Let's go to the next one. Dylan, bring up the next one. This is again, I did reverse chronological. This isn't every one of your posts. I just picked a select few to kind of give examples here. So let's go to the next one. There we go. July 24th. Is that the next one? Okay. All right, folks, let's dissect in detail this claim that we just observed Earth's hottest day on record. And this is similar to the other one, I think. And as a few outlets report, the hottest in over 100,000 years. And go ahead and give us a brief overview of this, Chris, because it's probably similar since we're talking about hottest days and highest number of heat wave days you just described.
So this claim, this is the Copernicus ECMWF, which is a European organization. It's called the European Center for Medium Range Forecast. They run the European weather forecast model, which you might hear about on your TV channel when they talk about snowfall totals. They'll compare the GFS with the European model. That's what
Mm-hmm.
they do. Back in July, I don't remember what date it was off the top of my head. I had to pull that up. When this was, just July 24th. They said a couple days before that, I think it was July 22nd, they had, in 23rd, they had the hottest day ever measured from a global average on record. Now, the thing about this data is that it only goes back to 1940. This is the ERA5 reanalysis. And reanalysis is essentially where you have physical observations, actual temperature observations or dew point out, whatever the thermodynamic variable is that you want to measure. But there's an incomplete picture. As I said, there's a lot of missing data. Even in 1940, there was a lot of missing data still. So say you have a temperature observation in DC that's maybe 100 degrees on July 24th. And then you have a temperature observation in Roanoke, Virginia, which might be 99 degrees, but you don't have any temperature observations between there. They basically just interpolate it with computer models, and they just guess. They make a best guess as to what the temperature should be. And they fill in the gaps by running a computer model with that data, and it creates a reanalysis. Now, don't get me wrong, this reanalysis,
Reliable can that be?
ERI5, is go ahead.
How reliable can that be?
Well,
The
in
guess.
terms of like, if you're trying to do like some like case studies on like previous like snowstorms and stuff like that, the large scale, even heat waves themselves, like the actual kind of pattern, especially in the upper atmosphere, the geopotential height field, pretty decent, accurate. But when it comes to the global average temperature, there's a lot of guessing and there's a lot of guessing that goes into it in general. It's a useful tool, but it doesn't have very high precision. And so it only goes back to 1940. So they get these limited observations they have, and they fill in all the gaps with model data. They just run a computer model, like a forecast model that goes out 7 days ahead of today, for example, and it gives you the temperature, well, the weather forecast, what weather forecasts are made from, and they just integrate the observations into there to create a comprehensive global picture. It's a nice tool. It's good for research, but it has its limitations. Problem with this, not only does it go back to 1940, is that they claim that they can measure the temperature down to the nearest hundredth of a degree Celsius, 2 decimal points. You cannot do that with model data and limited physical observations. You cannot get a temperature that precise. Even arguably getting it down to the nearest tenth of a degree, just 1 decimal point out, is questionable. And I should remind you that these records were broken only by a few hundredths of a degree.
So there's not that much of a change, enough to make it
Yeah.
significant enough for them to be the alarmists that they are, is
Yeah.
essentially what we're
It's
saying here.
nothing. And if it weren't the fact that we had measurements and model data to kind of solve this somewhat, nobody would be wiser to the fact. Nobody feels the global average temperature. I
No,
don't. Where are you located?
Cleveland, Ohio.
Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, what's the temperature there today?
It's a warm one today. It's around 91 today. That's the
Okay,
highest.
91.
Yeah, it's been in the
Yeah,
upper 80s the last couple of days, but a week ago we were topping out in the upper 60s. It's crazy. It's just been this weird little period of time here, which kind of
yeah,
illustrates the point in the difference between weather and climate, right? But
correct.
you know,
Yeah. So it's 80. It's 91 in Cleveland today. It's 87 degrees here. I don't feel the weather. The average of that is like 89 degrees, right? So I don't feel 89 degrees. I feel 87 degrees. You don't feel 89 degrees. You feel 91 degrees. You feel the local temperature. You don't feel the global average temperature, the average between two spots. Nobody feels global average temperature. It's not a very useful metric of anything of relevance to climate. Yes, it's useful for thermodynamic calculations and radiative transfer problems, and understanding the energy fluxes, because the higher the average temperature is, the more radiation is emitted out, more radiation is absorbed, more radiation is emitted. So we have those measurements. We do have that from satellite. It has to do with the Planck curve, which is a whole lesson in thermodynamics and radiative transfer. But that notwithstanding, you don't feel the global average temperature. You only feel what's happening in your neck of the woods. I don't feel 91 degrees in Cleveland. You don't feel the 87 degrees here. What you feel is
right.
91. What I feel is 87. So
And if
you can
Phoenix,
calculate the average temperature you can calculate the average phone number in a phone book, but that's not really useful. The average person, the average human has one testicle, but that's not useful. So global average temperature is not a really useful measure of assessing climate change impacts, because they always talk about, well, it's the impacts that matter. Well, global average temperature doesn't really is not the control knob of human welfare. Human conditions gotten better despite warming, or because of it in some cases, because human civilizations have in the geological past thrived. Now, this claim that it was the hottest in 100,000 years is just obvious nonsense. Yes, it kind of falls out of the scope of the scientific method, because you can't really prove it or disprove it. It very well could have been the hottest day in 100,000 years. I don't know. But the probability of that is actually exceedingly low. We do have proxy reconstruction data of ice cores and sediments, and the ratio of magnesium to calcium in certain shells and stuff, and sediments, and like this ocean floor. And we have, obviously ice cores. I said ice cores, the oxygen isotopes. Um, and we have tree rings stuff as well. And we can reconstruct past climates, but those resolution of that, each data point on a chart for the proxy data going back several thousands and tens of thousands of years, might be at best a couple of decades worth of data. So you can't get those individual spikes. You don't know what the temperature was for a single decade, much less that long ago, much less a single year, let alone a single month or a day. The cave-in didn't keep records, so we have no idea what the temperature was, set in the years on July 24th in 7,596 BC. We don't know. And anybody who says it was hotter than it was then They can't prove it. I
Nope,
can't
no
prove
clue.
I'm wrong, but they can't prove it either. And it's just exceedingly low. And it's actually probably not the hottest, even in the last 10,000 years, because between 10 and 6,000 years ago, during the early to mid Holocene thermal maximum, sea ice in the Arctic was extent was greatly reduced. There's several studies on this in the proxy reconstructions, and often ice was seasonal in the Arctic.
And
So,
so,
and
how did they?
ice is a very good temperature proxy. Ice, temperature is it's a very temperature sensitive data set.
Which is why the alarmists are always talking about the ice, the ice shelves, melting away, and the number of icebergs, and so on and so forth, and that's why the polar bears are all dying off because they don't have enough, ice and land, and that's provably inaccurate, is it not?
Yeah,
Because
well, actually,
every time they talk about ice being reduced in one particular area of the Antarctic or the Arctic, it's expanding like crazy on the other side. Isn't it all the same planet that is supposed to be experiencing the quote unquote warming?
yeah, it should be. There should be. There's kind of an inverse relationship between the Antarctic sea ice and the Arctic sea ice. For
Yeah.
many years, the alarmists would always fixate on the decline in Arctic sea ice extent and sea ice volume. And yes, we did begin measuring that in actually 1972. NASA has satellite data going back to 1972. However, they hide a lot of that data for whatever reason, and they start their graph in 1979. Now, if you look at, and this is the Arctic, and Antarctic, it starts in 1979 as well. But if you look at the Arctic in 1979, during the late 70s, we had some very, very cold winters 76, 77, 77, 78, 78, 79, even 79 and 80 was pretty cold in the United States. And there were fears of a coming ice age. Global temperatures had fallen by several tenths of a degree Celsius since the 1940s, based on their best estimates. Again, data spotty. Um, there was articles from the National Center for Atmospheric Research about this. There were articles in the Washington Post, New York Times about a coming ice age. There was fears over this coming ice age, and there's several accounts of the Arctic sea ice actually growing considerably from their low point in the 1950s and 40s and 50s to the 1960s and 70s. There were several. They did some aerial mapping with flying over planes. They didn't have satellites, but they had planes that they could kind of get a rough estimate. Um, and if you look at the temperature record in Iceland, their capital city, 1979 was their coldest year on record. This was at the end of a multi-decadal cooling trend when these measurements began, on when the satellites were equipped with this technology, remote sensing packages to estimate sea ice area and volume through remote sensing. And so when you start at a high point in sea ice, it's no wonder it's going to decline for several decades after that. But for many years, alarmists did not report on the fact that sea ice in the Antarctic, the South Pole, was actually increasing. Now that trend is kind of sort of flatlined because there's been significant reductions in Antarctic sea ice in the last few years. A lot of this is because the ice extent grew considerably. It was like the Antarctic sea ice extent, not Arctic, Antarctic, South Pole, reached its, since 1979, all-time maximum in the year 2014. So if global warming was responsible for the Antarctic melting during that period, why was it not doing the same in the Antarctic? It's a global warming, isn't it? And obviously there can be regional variations, but this calls into question some of those claims about the magnitude of this.
All of them.
Now, yeah, so when you look at that trend in the Arctic sea ice extent and volume, sea ice volume, the thickness, how much ice there actually is, surface is good for albedo, how much energy, because albedo, higher albedo equals more radiation, solar radiation being emitted back to space, so it doesn't warm the planet as much. But when you so sea ice extent just kind of gives a good aerial extent of like how much ice area there is for albedo purposes, but for how much ice there actually is, its volume is a better metric. Anyway, there's been no statistically significant trend in the September minimum. Because the metric that really matters is the minimum, the annual minimum. sea ice extent or volume in the Arctic in the last 17 to 20 years. And in fact, earlier this year, sea ice extent in the Arctic was higher at one point than it was in 1989 in the Arctic. So yes, sea ice area volume has declined in the north at the North Pole since 1979. But again, consider that was a high point, and also consider that there's not been much of a trend. The trend is kind of it goes down sharply into the 90s, 2000s, and it kind of flatlines after about 2006. There's been not
And
much of a trend. The Antarctic, and one could maybe even argue, especially if the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation goes into its negative mode, we actually might start to see ice in the Arctic grow a little bit, and we might start seeing it. There's some research out there suggesting that I don't know how much, I don't know what the dynamics are behind it. Again, I don't know everything, but there is some indication that there's an inverse relationship between the Arctic and Antarctic sea ice. I've seen people put that theory out there. I don't know much about it, but it seems interesting because it was kind of what we have observed. The reason the Antarctic sea ice extent right now in the South Pole is so low is because the aerial extent grew really rapidly up until about 2014, 2015. But the ice was very thin, first year ice. And with all the choppy water, the Southern Ocean is rough. It's just storms all the time. And the choppy waters, because the waves are driven by wind. And those waves break that ice apart. It's very thin. It's easy to break that ice apart. And you get a significant reduction in area. If it starts growing, it can only grow so much before eventually it becomes unstable and it all breaks apart, and you significantly
I want to
decrease your
summarize.
aerial extent.
Yeah, I want to summarize here because we want to get to a lot of the other slides here or posts that you have made here. But the bottom line is this argument that we hear from the alarmists that the amount of the sea ice area is declining all across the world because of global warming is just a flat out lie. It is not easily, you have to know what you're doing, but it is disprovable very simply. Let's get to some of the other posts here. Throw this next one up here. This one is from August 3rd. I'm sorry, where are we at? Okay, August 3rd. Bet you didn't know this. 36 states. No, okay, that's more on the same temperatures. Let's go. Let's continue on here because we're not going to have time for all of them anyway. There, that's a good one. Throw that one up there on the Barrier Reef. This is from August 9th. The mainstream media says the Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral reef system in the world, is in a rapid death spiral. The New York Times, with your headline there about that. And you went to an extensive explanation there about why that's garbage and tell me what that means, again, with respect to climate change assertions from the alarmists.
Well, the coral bleaching and the death of coral reef ecosystems has been a major poster child for climate alarmism, just as heat waves and hurricanes have been for the last 20 years or more. Now, coral bleaching is a real thing, and they can bleach, in fact, due to heat stress, due to really high ocean temp. They do thrive in warmer waters, but if it gets too warm, they can bleach, and we do see that from time to time. And some of that is probably due to the fact that the planet has warmed, and I think some of that is probably due to greenhouse gas emissions, some of it. But there's a lot of other factors to consider here. It's a very dynamic system. I mean, adding more CO2 to the atmosphere should cause some warming. Yes, Dr. William Happer and I went over this equation, but that's a whole different topic. But when you also have to consider clouds, and clouds models do not. It's a very big uncertainty, and is what happens with clouds. So we don't know how much really of the warming has been due to greenhouse gas emissions versus other factors like natural variability, internal variability, which climate models don't handle well. So that's kind of a tangent. But back to corals.
Mhm.
Yeah, the planet has warmed a little bit, and they do come under heat stress sometimes. But coral bleaching can occur due to a number of reasons. A lot of shallow reefs that are like just right below the surface of the water, there's regional changes in sea level that are driven by changes in wind patterns associated with, because wind will blow water mass away due to local changes in sea level driven by changes in the El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Nino La Nina. And there's times in different parts of the world where when the sea level drops, those shallow reefs get exposed to the open air.
Sure.
And reefs they can die or get bleached due to exposure to ultraviolet UV radiation. And obviously, when they're exposed to the open air, they're going to be exposed to more UV. they get killed. There was a 1993 paper on this, published in the journal Nature.
That shouldn't be happening, right? Because the sea levels are rising, we're being told.
Yeah. Well,
Well, I mean, Miami's underwater by now. I mean, right? I mean, it was supposed to be 20 years ago. Miami was supposed to be underwater.
yeah,
So were most of the Bahamas and all kind, and yet somehow,
Maldives.
yeah,
Yeah,
these island communities continue to thrive, or not island, but these coastal communities and island communities continue to thrive. And the wealthiest people in the world, who are all in on the climate change alarmism, continue to buy properties all along those places that are supposed to be underwater by now.
yeah. You would think that if there was truly like an imminent crisis, they would be selling their beachfront homes. So it's kind of interesting that they
Yeah,
don't
and
take
trying
it
to keep it
serious.
quiet.
They don't
Yeah,
take
trying
it
to keep it
serious.
quiet
Yeah.
for 10 years from now, that's gonna be all eroded away by the ocean, because they're rising like this, and just try, but they don't. They continue to buy them instead, which kind of, it makes a point. I wanna move to a couple of other quick posts that you have here, Chris. We only have about 5 minutes left. Um, Go on, Dylan, keep going forward there. Okay, that one will work. Global warming reveals Swiss mountain route unseen since Roman times. This is important because you talked before about the availability of things in before Christ and things of that nature in terms of what records are really accurate and so on and so forth. Climate alarmists say Earth is now hotter than it's been at any point in the last 100,000 years. You've covered that a little bit here, but retreating glaciers in Europe reveal ancient trading routes and artifacts not seen since the Roman times. So how did those get there 2,000 years ago? If everything was frozen then, and of course we've only warmed ever since that point.
Yeah, this is fun because climate alarmists will claim that it's the hottest it's ever been in 100,000 years, which we talked about earlier. The funny thing about this is that there's glaciers receding in Alaska and Glacier National, or not Glacier National Park. There's glaciers receding in Alaska. Glacier National Park's in Montana. I got it confused. And as glaciers receding in the Alps, that there's paths and there's artifacts that have been seen since the Roman times. And in the case of Alaska, there's trees that haven't been that are old ancient forests that were buried when the ice advanced during the Little Ice Age. Those trees were buried. Those trees are less than 10,000 years old. So how do those get there if it's the hottest it's ever been? Obviously it had to be warmer at some point if this stuff is being uncovered from the ice.
Exactly.
My boss, Craig Rucker at CFAC, he was headed to a UN conference, and he was at the airport, was talking to a climate scientist about this. And the climate scientist said, "Oh, it's the hottest it's been in 100,000 years." And uh, my boss was like, "But there's trees being uncovered underneath in ancient artifacts in Europe from ancient Rome, that are being uncovered, trails, trading paths that haven't been seen in 2,000 years. And you don't see how that's at all relevant to debunking your point." And then the climate scientist said, "No, I don't understand how that's at all relevant to my point." They don't. They're just ignorant.
That's
Um,
well, that's why they won't debate you guys. Everybody that I talk to that is a debunker, and I don't know if that's the right term, but you're trying to debunk the climate alarmism. They will not. Nobody will debate them. Do you know Gregory Wrightstone? I don't know if you
yeah,
know
I
Gregory.
know. I mean, it's a CO2 coalition. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had him on and we were talking. I said, when you bring all of these facts, like the ones you post on your Facebook and Twitter, Chris, when you bring all these facts into discussion with the other people who are trying to say that this is, the hottest on record and the sea levels rising and the glacial ice disappearing and all this other stuff, what do they say? And they say, I don't know. They won't talk to me. They literally will not meet me on a debate stage. They literally not be part of a panel, an academic panel to discuss these things, because when they cannot defeat the facts, the receipts, the information that you're talking about, the provable data, their entire political, which is what I think it is, agenda falls flat. And that's why they won't refuse to acknowledge your existence. Greg Wrightstone, Steve Gorham, a number of other people. They all are trying to bring the other side of the story out there to this climate alarmism. And the best way to defeat data that you cannot defeat with your own data is to crush and silence the bearer of the data that is the problem.
they went on a level playing field. Anytime that they've had a debate in the past, it always goes in the skeptics or lukewarmers' favor. The audience might even favor the alarmist side to begin with, but there was a debate between Dr. Andrew Dessler and Steve Koonin, physicist, um, and their audience was actually in favor of Dessler at the beginning. After the debate, however, majority of the audience swung to Koonin because he presented better, more compelling evidence to support his calls, his stance. That's why they refuse to debate, because they get publicly humiliated.
Yeah, well,
And
because again, the entire political movement, and I truly believe it's political because there's an agenda here, they're always saying, believe the science, trust the science, the science, the science, the science. You guys bring the science, and they say, I don't know how that's relevant. Whatever that same thing that the guy talked to your boss about? I don't know, see how that's relevant. The existence of these trails from Roman times. What are you talking about? They
well, you
can't.
can even you can even meet them in the middle. I mean, there is general, even among skeptic scientists, there's agreement that all else being equal, if you hold everything constant, adding CO2 to the atmosphere causes some warming. It's about, not considering feedbacks with clouds and other things, about 7/10 of a degree Celsius per doubling of CO2, but that's logarithmic because it takes more time to double the concentration. 2 to 4 ppm, which that would be dead, but it takes more time to get from 400 or 1600 or 800 1600 than it does from 400 to 800 parts per million. So it's kind of a logarithmic effect. But we agree that there's also urban heat island effects, there's land use changes. Those are much more significant in terms of human impact on climate than CO2 is, by orders of magnitude, several orders of magnitude. And we understand that, there's a radiation spectrum on CO2. We understand that. But there's no consensus on whether or not, how much of the warming is man-made. Is it 25, 50, 75%? We don't know how much warming there will be in the 21st century. We don't know what the equilibrium climate sensitivity is. There's like a 40+% margin of error on those estimates, and they keep getting a little bit lower. And we also don't know whether or not the warming's good or bad, and if it's bad, what to do about it. There's no
Yeah,
consensus on any of
right.
that, on the
No,
most consequential
and even
impact.
if we do acknowledge a slight warming because of the CO2 levels, like you're talking about, it's a pretty fair trade considering the fact that the CO2 levels are needed for all vegetation on the planet, for crying out loud. It is life giving. It is not
Yes,
life seeking.
CO2 was at 180 parts per million 20,000 years ago, coming out of the last glacial maximum. Had they dropped another 30 parts per million, photosynthesis becomes so inefficient in most plant species that they begin to die off. It affects the rest of the food chain. We probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation today. And historically, they've been on the order of several thousand parts per million. So we're still far away from that. We don't have enough fossil fuel reserves to probably ever get us to several thousand parts per million. Again.
Chris, I could let you sit here and educate us with more of this stuff for hours, but we are done. What I do want people to do is learn from you at your web pages. Your actual blog page is Chris Martz Weather. Your Facebook page is also Chris Martz Weather, and your your Twitter X is Chris Martz WX, which is short for weather. So make sure you follow him, read his work, and learn. And by the way, I love the presentation too. It's hilarious. You even say in your Twitter bio there that you're, in addition to being a meteorology and a student and so on and so forth, you're a comedian. You do present this with good humor. I think it really adds to it a lot. It's hard for people, even if they're alarmists, to get mad at you because you were presenting this in kind of a fun, engaging way. So that's what hooked me. I'm a follower and a fan. So I really appreciate you coming on, Chris. Keep up the great work. And I hope to get you on the radio. We'll have you on a regular basis on the radio. The hits are a little bit shorter, but you are constantly coming up with new information that I think everybody needs to hear. So I hope we can do that.
Thanks for having me, Bob. And anytime you want me on radio or back here to discuss more, I'll be happy to talk about something else, some other type climate related thing. So thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We will do it. Thank you, Chris Martz. All right, that's going to do it for Strictly Speaking. Make sure you share his information and follow him, and share it with other people in your social media circles who need to know the truth about what's really happening with our climate. And also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to be notified about all of our videos. New episodes are going to drop every Tuesday of Strictly Speaking, and we'll drop some of our favorite interviews from the vault of our first 100 episodes every Friday as well. You can watch us on YouTube, on Rumble, and you can also listen to us on Spotify. Thanks, everybody.